So in this video on review articles, I do want to point out some of the differences between review articles and systematic reviews. They are related. They're both reviewing literature in a particular area, but there are some significant differences. And so I'm going to address those and talk about some rhetorical moves and elements common to this genre, as well as show you an example, or show you some examples from the systematic review by Kara Felter on whole body vibration, which I included in the not in the required course material, in the suggested course material section as well. So if you want to take a look at that, feel free to do so. I just included certain passages to demonstrate some of the common elements of review articles. So let's get started. A review article is actually a genre of many names, and you might have noticed this in if you've looked at some of the articles about review articles. It sounds crazy, but some of the literature on review articles, they tend to call them different names. So here are some of them that are very common that basically mean the same thing. So review article, literature review, narrative review, or even an unsystematic narrative review. And I think narrative review or literature review kind of describe what a review article is. It reviews literature, similar to systematic review, just in a different way, not nearly as quote-unquote systematic, and in a more quote-unquote narrative way. So review articles provide a general overview of a topic of interest in a discipline. And so I think it's safe to say that review articles can be a lot broader than a systematic review. So remember back in the first video on systematic reviews when I've given you the example of, is vitamin C good for colds, which was was far too broad of a question to ask in systematic review. A review article might look into or might review literature on the use of vitamin C in treating common colds and other seasonal illnesses, right? Because it's broad enough. If you find enough literature, you can easily write a narrative review. So they're broader in scope, and also have a different purpose. Again, they both review literature with a different purpose in mind. So review articles are great for giving an introduction to relevant topics. So they're really particularly useful, I find, for novice researchers in a field, or let's say you're working with an interdisciplinary team of researchers, and you want to kind of get a better idea of your colleague's specialty. A review article would give you a good overview of a particular aspect of a field of research. Experts in an area usually write review articles. Often they get asked to write those for journals, but you can also submit review articles. That happens as well, particularly if your work is very specialized and you feel that there has been now a substantial body of evidence accumulating on this topic, but there hasn't been a major review on it. That's a good point to approach an editor of a journal saying, hey, I would like to write a review article on this particular area. Would this be of interest to you? So you can actually make some connections that way as well. The downsides of review articles, I alluded to those a little bit. They are a weak form of evidence to make decisions about certain treatment options, right? So that's not how our review articles, it's not their main function. Compared to systematic reviews, but that is definitely one of the functions of systematic review, is to help us make decisions about certain treatment options. A review article doesn't do that. It reviews treatment options, and it can review a large body of evidence around it, but it's not a strong form of evidence. There is a relative high degree of bias in there, and that's just usually because even though there might be a level of systematic approach to selecting the literature for a review article, it tends to be less organized and less standardized than for systematic reviews, particularly when meta-analyses are involved. So that automatically leads to a greater degree of bias. And one level of bias is an article that I'm including in the supplemental course material. It's a little longer article about different types of review articles, including systematic reviews and these literature reviews, or unsystematic narrative reviews, if you will. And one of the points the authors in there make is that often because experts in the field of writing review articles, often their own work is included in the review. And there have been cases where the reviewer or the writers of a review article left out work by a competitor whom they didn't like, or whose work they didn't appreciate. And so that can, again, there is a bias there, and there is less possibility to control for that. compared to systematic review. So there's a lack of systematic method to select studies, which I mentioned already. And this is really the direct comparison systematic review, where it's highly systematic. It's a highly systematic and standard way to select studies for for systematic review. So let's talk about the typical structure of a review article, right? There's usually an introduction, very similar to an intro in an IMRAD article. It provides a general background of the topic. There's some discussion of the relevance of the topic. Usually authors identify the research gap that the topic of the current review has filled, right? So basically saying, hey, so far in the field of, now let's think about vitamin C, of vitamin supplements, nobody has written about vitamin C for the common cold. So, but in the last 10 years, there have been a lot of studies on this, and so this is the review of these studies. Just to take you through that kind of thinking. The introduction also outlines the scope of the review, and there's usually a section that sometimes can be separate, and it's almost like a method section where it explains the literature search. So the author will explain how they search the literature. It's kind of like a method section. The middle section, there's really three parts: intro, middle, and conclusion, just to give it away here. So the middle section can look very different depending on the nature or the topic of the review, right? It presents the various themes the author has identified. Information can often be presented in chronological order if that's appropriate for that particular topic. It might not always be appropriate. Thematic might work better, but then within the certain sub-themes, you might have a chronological order. So again, their authors have a little bit of freedom here to decide how they want to structure their review. Again, thinking about what's the best way to present the evidence. And the conclusion, similar again to IMRAD, points to the bigger lessons based on the review of the existing studies, any suggestions for future research and implications for the discipline, potentially for practice, depending again on the context. So again, similar to IMRAD, the middle section tends to be more narrative than the typical methods and results section in IMRAD article, because that's where there's some thick description, so to speak, some review of the different pieces of literature that are included in the review article. So some common rhetorical moves in review articles are to describe the purpose of the review early on in the intro, the description of the literature search process, right, and that includes information about which databases were used. This is a pretty standard procedure to let your readers know which databases you've searched, because that can affect what you find to include in your review article. Some other common moves are using subheadings based on the organization of the middle section, and I mentioned it could be thematic, chronological, again, depending on the topic. There is usually discussion of limitations and future directions, inclusion of tables that list all or some of the consulted literature, and I'll show you an example of what that might look like based on Kara's article here. And this is the citation for the article I'm using. I didn't include it on every slide, but every slide for the rest of this presentation, the quotes come from this particular article. Again, it's linked via the course reserves, because you can't, we don't have our databases don't have a PDF version of this. I had to order it through interlibrary loan. So it's available to you in the interlibrary loan or in the course reserve section of our class. So purpose of the review, right? One of the rhetorical moves, one of the typical rhetorical moves. So here's how this author does it. The purposes of this review are the following. One, to summarize recent findings related to the use of whole body vibration for people with spinal cord injury. It's been abbreviated earlier. To explain the significance for clinical practice and to outline future areas for research. A typical phrase that we find in most research literature, be it a randomized controlled trial, a systematic review, literature review, narrative review, and so on. So here are some two quotes to show you how authors tend to describe the literature search process. So here, the first one, the terms whole body vibration and spinal cord injury are used to conduct the initial searches in, here they are, PubMed, Scopus, Embase, and CINAHL, with the limiters of human subject studies conducted in the past 10 years and published in English. So right there you know, okay, if somebody's older than 11 years and was published not in English, it won't be included in here. Additional literature was identified from the reference lists of articles found in the original search. So just some more information, how the author came up in a fairly systematic way to include the articles she has included in here. And I say she because Kara is identified as female. So in the second part here, another example of how the literature search process can be described. Articles investigating whole body vibration were incorporated regardless of how the vibration was delivered. This involved subject positions of standing, semi-squat, reclined on a tilt table, and seated. Also, both forms of whole body vibration production, vertical and side alternating, were included. So it again gives you as a reader more information about how, how the studies that are being reviewed here have found their way into this review. Now, the other rhetorical move that is common, as you probably now realize, since I talk about this all the time, are subheadings in different article formats. And again, very useful rhetorical moves in most genres. I want to show you this quote because this quote shows us the actual subheadings that are used for that middle section of the article, right? So these are the headings for that middle section, really the bulk of the review article. So whole body vibration has been promoted for use in individuals with spinal cord injury for the following 6 reasons: to increase bone mineral density, improve this, reduce progress, enhance, and so on. So there's 6 of them, and then there's additional one that didn't quite fit into this list, I guess, because it's just another couple of studies. The subjective response to whole body vibration. So there's a total of 7 sections, meaning 7 subheadings that correspond to these 6 plus 1 elements outlined in the introduction. Right? So it's a really nice way to also foreshadow these headings, because I can then, as a reader, I recognize these throughout the entire text. So very organized. And this is a typical feature of any review article, systematic or narrative. They're highly organized, right? Like all writing really is, but they're particularly driven by organizing a large body of information into manageable pieces for us as readers. So discussion of limitations and future directions. Here's one quote, three quotations I've used. Limitations to the current research include that the heterogeneity, there's that word again that we had earlier, of study aims and protocols makes it difficult to draw conclusions or identify specific parameters to best improve the myriad of impairments seen status post spinal cord injury. Another one, specific areas for future research were outlined in each section of this review, right? So she doesn't give an overall suggestion, but there's also some for each of those 7 sections. But she also provides some general suggestions. Generally include larger sample size and the implementation of longitudinal studies to quantify the durability of results. And then lastly, clinical decision-making at this time should be guided by careful consideration in light of the limited but emerging research in this area, right? So there is also some value, some sort of interpretation or some evaluation of the level of evidence, similar to systematic reviews in that sense, but not nearly as, for the lack of a better word, systematic or organized and formulaic as it is in systematic reviews. But again, review articles evaluate the evidence as well, but again, are more subjective in nature, and don't follow a very strict protocol that systematic reviews do, particularly those with meta-analyses. And then I mentioned this earlier in the slide on rhetorical moves for review articles, that often you'll find a table of included literature, and Kara here included a table, summary of original non-case study experiments investigating whole body vibration in people with spinal cord injury in the past 10 years. And it's actually a much longer table, so I've taken out, I couldn't fit it on in one screenshot, just to give you an idea what it might look like. So the proposed benefit, the author, study type, participant information, parameters, major outcomes. So if I just wanted to get a quick overview of some of the non-case study experiments that look into this matter, here I could look at and quickly sort of compare back and forth what some of the literature consulted for this review article says about this particular intervention.